of mankind. Small fragmentary splinter movements of this kind have appeared at frequent intervals, but have never amounted to anything. So the excitement grew immediately. Men of tomorrowness, whether they were affiliated with anything or not, were greatly moved by the dignity, the humanity, the nobility of these manifestos, and all were most anxious to join. So that at that moment the society had its best press, and there was a tremendous popular interest. Everybody began to look around, and there's very interesting contemporary records dealing with this subject. Alchemists began searching desperately because they believed these Rosicrucian brothers or adepts probably had the secrets of the transmutation of metals, the mystery of eternal youth, and the medicine or the elixir of life. So they were searching for them. Progressive political leaders were very anxious to be affiliated with this organization. Philosophers, scholars, divines, clergymen, even priests, bishops were doing everything they could to find out where these brothers were. And the furor got greater and greater. But there wasn't any address to address a letter to. There wasn't anyone who seemed to be able to give any information whatsoever. Letters sent to mysterious adepts were always returned unopened. At the same time, of course, as well might be expected, a whole group of charlatans masquerading under weird titles and looking important drifted through various communities, were immediately identified as Rosicrucians. But again, these evaporated without very much contribution to the public good. One early description of such an adept is contained in a delightful little book called The Complete History of an Unknown Man. This is exactly what it was. And when you got through with the history, the man was still completely unknown. The only thing about him that was demonstrable as of any historical significance was that he was a sort of a Pied Piper, for he went into one small German town and whistled all the rats out of the houses. This was his only claim to Rosicrucian identification. The hopelessness of trying to communicate with these brothers left only one alternative, the want ad column. Now, of course, at that time, newspapers were not really what they are today. In fact, in Venice, newspapers were still being written by hand, one copy for each subscriber. So this wasn't very successful. The only thing that appeared to be feasible was to publish small booklets, 10, 15, 20 pages, some of them only 8 pages, in which some aspiring candidate would state his qualifications, assure the Brotherhood that he would be their dedicated servant, and to please let him know where to reach them. Then these booklets were published in small numbers of 500 or 1,000 and circulated throughout Europe in the hope that they would fall into the hands of one of the brothers, and he in turn would communicate with the aspirant to membership. Probably 50 or 100 of such publications are already known, and there were undoubtedly many more. Again, however, these were not effective because the writers of them, most of them, later wrote other works complaining that their first brochures were ignored. So we had this little cycle of literature that only supports the fact that in 1616, the adepts of the Rosy Cross were as difficult to find as they are now. And situations didn't really better much. But we should go along with some consecutive thought and try to feel out the situation a little further. Gradually, another type of literature arose. As the Rosicrucians decided not to speak for themselves, a very interesting but not necessarily enlightening group of apologists appeared. Among the apologists being our friends Meyer and Flood. These apologists would write an elaborate manifesto, thesis, document, or perhaps even a fine large folio in small print. The substance of the book being that if the Rosicrucians wished to remain unknown, it was their right to do so, and nobody had any reason to question it. Well, to wade through 250 pages of medieval Latin to learn this was itself rather disappointing. These apologists, however, gradually developed imaginations, which is not uncommon and is still a practice found among mystical writers. Not being able to learn anything else, they began to decide for themselves what Rosicrucianism was. And by 1650, we had a dozen or more fine texts on the subject, no two of which agreed with each other, and each one of them propounding to expound the original mystery of the fraternity. I can agree with Mr. Waite in the fact that you can read them all and gain nothing. Some of them are very interesting. Most of them are a bit desperate. Several of them are permeated with a general atmosphere of futility. But after a time, we find another note coming in, namely the quest for the fast dollar. And even as early as 1650, people were not completely without that little mercenary twist of mind. By the 50s and 60s, a whole group of self-proclaimed Rosicrucians were available to anyone who wished to sample their fare. They wrote extensively. One of them was John Hayden, who did quite an elaborate series of works in his Holy Guide describing the temples, palaces, and shrines of the Rosicrucian fraternity in England. Unfortunately, he failed to give any locations, and therefore we got not too much comfort or consolation, but he did write with great erudition. In fact, he had ideas that no one before him or since have ever fallen upon or really adequately quoted. By the end of the 17th century, by 1680 or 90, the situation had reached a dead end. It passed into a dignified limbo. The original society had never claimed any distinction by its action. It had never come forth and revealed itself. Its early circle of apologists were gone. The secondary circle were already mingling their Rosicrucian interests again with the stream of alchemy and hermetic arts, and these in turn were beginning to wane under the impact of the rise of experimental science. Minds were now turning more to chemistry and archaeology and antiquities and the development of various remedies based upon scientific knowledge. So everything remained comparatively quiet until the beginning of the 18th century, when we had quite a revival of Rosicrucian thinking. This second cycle, however, begins to take on an entirely different color. We now find the subject becoming more and more involved in ritualism and ceremonialism. The rise of Rosicrucian secret societies. These societies sprang up in many areas. There is no evidence or proof that they had any foundations of the original order, but at that time communication was poor. The public mind was open to almost any innovation, and the general difficulties politically of the countries of Europe seemed to cause people to take particular interest in something of a hopeful, idealistic, or mystical nature. These secret societies did gather into themselves a number of interesting people, some of them rather brilliant people, but it cannot be said that the mainstream of the subject was in any way enriched. In fact, it perhaps was a little impoverished, because now the old landmarks were pretty much obscured unless you had the time, patience, and wealth to investigate the original sources. This drifted along through most of the 18th century. And during this time also we began to find the rise of Masonic fraternities, both regular and irregular, in various parts of Europe. Freemasonry developed a kaleidoscope of degrees. Every inventive and ingenious individual had another Masonic rite. This situation continued to compound itself until there was really no rhyme or reason left in the gradually developing structure of Freemasonry. Finally, near the end of the 18th century, the great Congress of Wilhelmsbad was brought together, convened for the purpose of clarifying the Masonic situation. Among the delegates at this Congress, by the way, were two names also associated sometimes with Rosicrucianism, the Count Cagliostro and the Count de Saint-Germain. These were delegates at the Congress of Wilhelmsbad. As a result of that, Masonry cleaned house and relegated most of its doubtful degrees to the historical and archaeological department. And again, Rosicrucianism waned and became more or less concerned or involved in certain specialized groups of Masonic scholars. The 19th century didn't add a great deal to this picture. It did, however, clarify the Masonic position in connection with the Rosicrucian order. Movements arose of Masonic research and scholarship, like the Lodge of the Quarta Coronati in London, the Lodge of the Four Kings, which was the great Masonic research lodge, which worked with old beliefs, legends, rituals, degrees, and more or less became involved in the Rosicrucian controversy through its overlapping membership. One of the members, Dr. W. Wynne Westcott, was also the head of the Societas Rosicrucianus in Anglia, which was a Freemasonic auxiliary devoted to Rosicrucian studies, admission requiring that the candidate be a Master Mason. During the latter part of this century, a great American Masonic scholar, General Albert Pike, Sovereign Grand Commander of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry of the Southern Jurisdiction, received an invitation from Europe to found a Masonic Rosicrucian auxiliary in this country. I have seen the correspondence in the House of the Temple at Washington, and if my memory does not fail me, the letter was answered by General Pike's son. And in this letter, the son points out that his father is now in too advanced years and too heavily burdened with other responsibilities to undertake the establishment of a Masonic research body of Rosicrucian interest in the United States. So that the Masonic end, as far as this country is concerned, ends more or less in this way, although one small Masonic research group, the Society Rosicruciana in America, was founded and did flourish for a little while in the northern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite. Beyond this point, the Rosicrucian controversy more or less fades out so far as Masonic, alchemical, political, and illuminist problems are concerned. And in the late years of the 19th century and in the opening years of the 20th century, Rosicrucianism took on very largely the aspect of a Christian theosophy, and as such did create and does maintain organizations in this country dealing perhaps to a degree with Rosicrucian problems, but very largely concerned with mysticism or with the esoteric aspects of man's life. None of these organizations are able to use any of the original texts as a basic text for their own work, however, because no text of the original order dealing with any of its mystical practices or beliefs is known to exist. Now Mr. Waite takes on another position here, which perhaps is of some interest to us. He now assumes that the entire descent of the Rosicrucian Society was completely secret, that it is actually impossible to trace either its doctrine or its ritual from any exoteric organization that has appeared. that there are certain fraters or brothers of the society that have, as in the old Pythagorean school,